So if you were to speak to the institutional investor world, what would the advice be to them?
You prepare for war, but you strive for peace.
Climate governance is about ensuring boards can steer their companies through climate risk with competence, independence, and foresight. Do you think this is happening?
No, it's not.
Scenarios 1.5 or more.
Okay, this one gets me really upset.
Welcome to Sustainability Wire, the show that plugs into the thinking that moves sustainable finance. I'm Lorenzo Saa. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Clarity AI, and I'm excited today to cover the topic of climate governance. It's clearly a topical issue if we just think that the year that we just finished was considered one of the three hottest years in the tracking of history that we've had. And if we just think of how COP30 finished with, the sense that the Paris Agreement goals are pretty far away from us, and that in the geopolitical context, there wasn't a sense of that getting any better. And if anything, the US has left the Paris Agreement altogether. So in thinking of the episode today, we said, look, what do businesses do in this context? And specifically, what do the boards of those businesses do? And then, since a lot of the listeners are institutional investors, how do institutional investors work with the board to address the issue of climate? And so as we look at that, we really are excited today to have Karina Litvack. Karina got 30 years of experience really across the board, first as a sustainable investor, at FNC for I think something like 15 years, and you'll tell us more about that. And then as a board member itself at large oil and gas company, and other board roles. So Karina, we are really excited to have you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Amazing. Look, I think we can start from a little bit of what got you here. I've known of you because of your role in Eni, and we met again at the ICGN recently in Milan. But what got you into sustainable investments, and ultimately, why getting on these boards?
Wow. I don't want to make this too long and tedious a story, but let's just say that I started off in investment banking, and that was a good vaccination about what I felt I didn't want to do. And so I left and moved into low-income housing in Harlem. And basically worked in urban regeneration for a few years. And that was really what got me very motivated to think about business, property development, investment, and how it can, solve major societal and environmental problems. Fast forward to 10 years later when I was living in the UK and couldn't somehow break into the property sector because knowledge is very, very local, and I'd been doing this in New York City. And so I pivoted back into the City of London, but landed into what was then called ethical investment. And we're talking 1997. So in 1997, this was not fashionable. It was very fringe. And I was kind of, the anomaly at my investment banker dinner parties, because my husband is an investment banker. So that's kind of the genesis. I then did, as you rightly say, 17 years, 15 of which at FNC, in sustainable investment. And shortly after I left, the investors approached me and invited me to serve on my first corporate board. I had been on various trade association boards and NGO boards, which, was kind of a reasonable training ground, but nothing like what awaited me in a corporate board, particularly an oil and gas major like Eni, otherwise known as ENI. So what then really got me thinking and moving on a completely different track was the realization that if I was going to have any kind of constructive impact on the board, the staff, the company. It wasn't enough for me to just bring what I knew to be the investor view. I really needed to invent something different that was more tailored to the needs of directors, because there was no how-to manual on what directors need to do to really, first of all, even apprehend what the climate challenge means in different sectors, particularly in my case, oil and gas. But then secondly, how to make it, how to embed it in the strategy. And so my first port of call was the CEO, and he was very receptive, to his credit. And from there, I really got to work creating an initiative, which is now known. In fact, it was relaunched just yesterday on the 22nd of January, 2026, as the Chapter Zero Alliance. So it was known as Chapter Zero in a number of countries, also Climate Governance Initiative. Anyway, we're in 33 or 34 chapters in 72 countries, and the whole purpose of this organization is to mobilize board directors, educate them, give them skills, contacts, and confidence to be effective advocates in their boardroom for the adoption of a Paris-aligned climate transition strategy. And we define that very holistically to include nature, to include the just transition, really to include all the aspects that a board is responsible for: risk, strategy, audit, remuneration, human capital, you name it. There isn't anything, quite honestly, IT, AI, all of these things ultimately have a bearing on the climate transition strategy and vice versa.
That's great. Look, and I'll come back to you on Chapter Zero Alliance in a second. But if we take your experience on these boards, and if you had to say, forcing you to say, what are the three things that really make climate governance successful, what would those be?
Well, I would say in the very first instance, even ahead of board directors becoming educated, is good leadership by the chairman. Without a chairman who embraces this and enables it, it's very difficult. Okay, so that's fundamental. And then accepting that for most companies, this is a new field. This is outside the comfort zone of the majority of directors, much like, AI and any number of other topics is outside the comfort zone of most directors. You may, if you're lucky, you'll manage to snag the occasional, deep expert who also has the capacity to be an effective generalist and therefore effective board member. But by and large, good climate aware directors need to be made. They're difficult to just pick off a tree, right? So the next step is, thanks to a chairman who enables this, an open-mindedness on the part of the members to learn. And that means getting educated and getting challenged. And when I say educated or trained or whatever word you want to use, induction, not just from staff. It's very important that we get briefings from staff when we're directors to understand what's going on inside the company. But that's never the whole story. We also have to, get access to experts outside the company, whether it's through the company bringing experts in to speak to all of us at once, or us seeking, exposure and challenge and education from lots of, diverse people with diverse points of view. So, going to the ICGN conference, the International Corporate Governance Network conference, is one such way. But there are lots of sources of expertise. And then the third thing is, I would say, properly, I hate this word, but I'm going to use it, empowering the board. So in some boards, and in my boards, I have found that it's most effective to delegate to a committee the responsibility for really digging into these issues. And the reason I have found that that works better is because although it is always the responsibility of the entire board, and it has to flow back up to the entire board, and decisions need to be taken by the entire board, the entire board does not have the time or the bandwidth to dig deep into these issues, just like it doesn't have the time and bandwidth to dig deep into audit questions or remuneration questions or nominations questions. It's perfectly standard practice to delegate, fairly complex issues to a committee. So I think that that works very well. But then, in order to avoid silos, and that's always the worry, for example, when I was chair of ENI's Sustainability and Scenarios Committee, and we were, of course, if you like, the owner of the climate transition brief, it didn't sit uniquely with us because I did joint meetings. I invited, if not the entire committee, then certainly the chair of the Risk Committee and Statutory Audit Board. I invited members from nominations when we were looking at a just transition or human capital issue. It so happened in ENI that all the members of the Remuneration Committee, myself included, were members of the Sustainability and Scenarios Committee. So it wasn't necessary. We were already de facto integrated. But I do really think it's important for there to be really fluid relations between committees so that you avoid that siloing that effectively disables the activities of the board in this area. It does mean that there's sometimes some duplication, but better that than to have things fall between the cracks.
Cool. So great leadership from the chair, open-mindedness to learn, and this empowerment via committees that though are fluidly connecting to the rest, which I think is three great pieces of advice. Look, I know that the WEF has a specific definition of climate governance. In fact, it says climate governance is about ensuring boards can steer their companies through climate risk with competence, independence, and foresight. Do you think this is happening?
No. It's not. I mean, obviously there's a minority of boards out there that has taken ownership of this and takes it very seriously. But by and large, I don't think we're there yet. At best, what happens is that you have management that will do this reasonably well with the board kind of going along for the ride. But it's pretty unusual that the board should drive this in the way that I think it needs to. Of course, handing over to management to, do the, frankly, the heavy lifting, the thinking through, the coming back to the board for monitoring and further guidance, and of course, progress review by the board. And by the way, one of the really interesting aspects of this monitoring and progress review is the role of the audit committee in developing mechanisms for measuring how the execution of the climate transition strategy is unfolding relative to goals, interim goals, long-term goals. So there's so many governance actions that really do need to sit with the board and where the board needs to work very collaboratively with management. So are we there? Absolutely not. We're not there. What's challenging is that, and I don't mean this as an excuse for inaction, it's just that we need to be realistic about the challenges that we're up against. We have, entered a period of unusual confusion and policy flip-flopping and politicization of a topic that is above politics, should always be above politics. And that makes it difficult, not impossible, but difficult for boards to be as focused as they should and as they had the opportunity to be until a few short years ago. So we have to live with that, and we have to get through it. And we have to, of course, remind ourselves that the laws of science don't change, even if the political context does.
But in this new political context, should boards kind of go undercover and kind of keep the topic silent or quiet and encourage businesses to do so? Or to the opposite, is there more of a, stand your ground and call it out?
Well, I'm more in the latter camp, personally. I am really one who believes in having the courage of your convictions and standing up transparently for what you believe is right. And the reason for that is that I think it serves to reassure others who have doubts that they're not alone and that we're all in this together. On the other hand, I do have sympathy for colleagues who are operating in much more challenging environments where they are literally faced with litigation for the merest, utterance. They're accused of cases are manufactured against the company, the CEO, or they are, suddenly dropped if they're, for example, an asset manager, dropped by certain public authorities from supplying fund management services. And that can be very, very damaging economically. So I understand why companies would want to kind of, put their head below the parapet rather than waiting for it to be shot off. I get that. I think we in Europe were not quite as exposed, and so we owe it to ourselves and to our colleagues in places that are more challenged to be braver about what we stand for. And so I'm very fortunate that the corporate board on which I serve at the moment, which is Terna, operates first of all in an industry which is power grid transmission that is inherently associated with electrification and therefore the transition. But also we operate in pretty much one country. I mean, for all intents and purposes, and that country is part of the EU, and we're insulated from these pressures. Not totally. Politics do interfere in some ways, but basically we're not exposed in the way that some of our peer companies are. But it's not easy for everybody, and so we have to do the best we can and be pragmatic. I do think, though, and what you referred to as greenhushing, I think if you can afford not to, you should look for every way possible not to engage in greenhushing, because greenhushing is damaging. It's damaging to the narrative of what the company stands for. It's damaging to morale. It sends really confusing messages to external stakeholders. It gives the impression of delegitimizing something that is very important and needs to grow rather than shrink. So,
Karina, can I jump in there, because
yes.
I'm curious to see how you see specifically then the evolution of the different net zero initiatives.
Yeah.
And how these evolutions might help or worsen the sort of role that the board has in engaging on these issues.
Yeah.
So,
well,
this
is what I spend most of my time on. So I'm glad you asked the question. And I will interpret your question as referring to the fact that some of these industry associations, Net Zero Banking Alliance, Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, Net Zero Insurance Alliance, all of these groupings, there's also the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which has been somewhat less affected, but have lost members. Climate Action 100 Plus has lost entire chunks of its membership, and that makes things very much more difficult. I, of course, have had conversations with many of the organizations that have exited, as well as those who are left behind. Those who have exited will swear up and down that they continue to do exactly what they were doing before. They're just not doing it by acting collectively. And that's a little bit contradictory, because collective action is actually a very big part of what we try. It's a big tool in our toolbox. And so to drop out of that makes it harder for everybody else. And this is one of those things where we need to work together. And so quitting the team is not good. But again, as I said earlier, I understand where that's coming from. And it behooves these organizations to do even more quietly if they can't do it publicly. So it's interesting. I mean, one of the banks that I spoke with that, is in the public eye a lot, recounted to me a conversation with a major client where the client said, it was an American client, we too are in the firing line, but we don't have any alternative. We are on the front lines of the climate crisis by virtue of the industry in which we operate, which is agriculture. So we have to carry on doing the right thing, not because it's right for society, but because it's right for our commercial survival. It's an existential question for us as a company. So the conversation between this client and this bank was, what can you continue to do for us in terms of financial advice and product development and financing to enable us to carry on in our, pathway to, building climate resilience despite the, the hurricane that is, circling above our heads.
So if you were to speak to the institutional investor world that you worked for many years, on how best to engage now with the boards, which you now work for, again, what would the advice be to them? What would be the three things investors could do to empower these boards to take the topic on?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I actually, a lot of what I do as a director, I'm prohibited from speaking to investors on behalf of my company. Those are the constraints that I face in my own company. But I'm not restricted from talking about general issues, and that is why I attend investor conferences and meet privately and also speak. And it's all about that. And those conversations are, first of all, don't let up, because what you say has far more impact than you realize. That's the first thing. A lot of investors, myself included when I was one, would often get demoralized thinking, well, we're a minority who raises these questions and we're not listened to. Actually, don't be so sure. Those questions have impact, but they will have much more impact if you put the work into it. And that's my second sort of recommendation, which is take the time to find out what is specifically tailored to that company. Don't come with a template with the same identical 5 questions to every company, because that is so transparently lazy and it has no effect. So if it means talking to fewer companies, if it means dividing and conquering by working collaboratively with other investors, which I know has its challenges these days, but, splitting things up that way to be able to dedicate more time, if it means choosing your battles more selectively, whatever it takes to do quality over breadth, or depth over breadth, quality over quantity, so that the questions are genuinely targeted and impactful. And the other thing I would really implore investors to do is to ask to speak to the boards directly, because we are, with the exception of the UK and maybe the Netherlands, in the larger companies, we in boards are heavily intermediated by management, investor relations, and CFO or CEO. And so we don't have direct contact with investors. And that means that we have a very kind of fuzzy view of what investors expect of us specifically. We can read broker reports, and that's better than nothing. But I was on the board of a UK company at one stage where our house broker came to us and gave us a detailed briefing of what investors were saying to us. And it was a no punches pulled presentation that told us all the criticisms that we were facing from the investor community. I had never experienced that before, certainly not in my Italian boards, because what we get is the sanitized view that, they love us. And, human nature is to find holes and pick them. So we need to know what the criticisms are that we are facing in everything, not just climate. But when it comes to climate, we really need the investors to stay the course. And that means being quite vigilant. For example, when you're looking at the say on pay vote, put the time in, please, to look at the wrinkles that are going to make that vote more or less impactful.
So that's interesting. So one thing investors use is stewardship with companies. Maybe not directly with the board, though.
No.
I hear you say. So is stewardship a tool that has helped ultimately this climate governance and climate progress on companies, or as some have stated in recent reviews, has been pretty irrelevant?
So the answer to that question is an interesting one because, and I remember this painfully from my own days as an investor, there is a perception, which is actively cultivated, by the way, in boards, that the stewardship teams are there for show and that the real decision makers are the portfolio managers. This is obviously true in active management. If you're running a tracker fund, it's obviously completely different. And then suddenly the vote matters. The tracker funds are very large and where the vote goes matters. But I would say that as important as it is for investors to engage with companies and boards wherever they can possibly get access, obviously if they're larger, it's easier to get access. It's equally important to have effective engagement internally, so that investors present a united front to companies. The worst nightmare of a stewardship team, and I know my former colleagues will hear this, is when the investor, the portfolio manager says to the CFO or CEO, "Oh, ignore them. They're just the stewardship team. I don't care about that stuff." And sadly, there are portfolio managers who speak that way. So that's not acceptable. And when I was running my team, we were in a perpetual charm offensive to the investment management team, and to show them that we actually help you. We build connections, friendships with corporate leaders that are valuable to you. So we need to work together. That's a really important thing. But that is that kind of division within investment firms can be quite damaging to the overall, effort to get this issue on the agenda.
So you're saying kind of for proper corporate engagement externally, you almost need a proper internal corporate.
Absolutely. Get your house in order. Do not run the risk of being undermined by your own colleagues.
Great. Now, how much, especially given your role in ANI, and maybe you can respond thinking of that role, but how much does being a board risk becoming an advocacy role, and how do you distinguish a board role that is trying to maintain climate governance from an advocacy role?
I don't think we're in danger of slipping into that anytime soon. If only. Because the hurdles that we face to getting the issue properly prioritized are such that, the priority of the board is, and for a very long time will remain, the business of business is business. I don't think we need to be particularly concerned. It's the opposite problem. But what is a risk is that an individual become perceived as a one-trick pony, the person who only ever pipes up because he or she has a question on climate. And that's really counterproductive. It discredits that person. And so that's why, as a board member, it's essential to be an effective generalist and then develop certain areas of specialism. And we all do. There's always that person who, is passionate about, corporate finance or IT or whatever it is that they happen to have done in their previous day job. And we need to kind of meld all of those skills, but we all have to be generalists and we all have to engage on, if not all the issues and certainly most of them, otherwise we will be perceived as ineffectual.
I'm curious, I just recently joined Chapter Zero Alliance. So
welcome.
Thank you. So in a really short answer, almost like elevator pitch, what is it and why would one join?
It is an organization whose entire mission is about enabling you, a board director, to do your job more effectively, develop the arguments, but develop also the soft skills and the contacts with fellow directors, but also with subject matter experts and with key stakeholders, including investors, but also academics, also civil society leaders, also labor leaders, etc., so that you get a really holistic view of all the factors that are affecting your companies and can be better informed and just more impactful in the boardroom. And if you join not as a director, but as an expert in some other way, welcome, because we need you. We need you to help educate our directors. When I started what is now the Chapter Zero Alliance, I turned very heavily to the investor community. In fact, it's the investor community that planted the seed in my head about the need for something like this. So they get a lot of the credit for this organization. And they are a really, really critical stakeholder in what we are trying to achieve.
Look, you mentioned AI earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And AI is being seen from many as the solution for climate change and from many as the great cause of climate change.
Yep.
What sort of preparedness you've seen board members have on AI? And in what way would you encourage getting prepared for a better way of including AI as part of the climate solution versus the climate cause?
Right. So, first of all, to your initial point, in my personal experience of the boards I've been on, it's not a skill set that anybody possesses. And there certainly aren't enough individuals out there who have that skill set from, years of having grown up in that industry and are also ready, what we say, board ready. So we need to acquire the expertise. We need to bring it in. And how it is brought in really, really matters. And that's not just as it applies to climate, but I will come to that question. It's how it is brought to the board generally. And unfortunately, a lot of is kind of going through the motions and, once a year, twice a year, we've had a briefing and it has been, frankly, not that useful. So, and I remember once, musing to a colleague who was an AI expert, and I said to him, I feel like really discouraged because I know that these people are saying individual words that I understand, but strung together, I have no idea what they mean when they're brought together, right? And this person said to me, in that case, your presenter was doing a really lousy job because his job was to communicate with you in a way that you understood. And that is what we try to do with climate governance as well. it's hopeless if we understand each other, but our colleagues don't understand what we're trying to get across to them. So that's really the first thing, is that this is a new field for the majority of directors, and we have to gain a minimum degree of literacy. On the question of climate, yes, undeniably, the soaring demand for energy or electricity to power data centers and therefore to enable AI is extremely disruptive. In my current board, it happens to be an opportunity, but it's too much of a good thing. I mean, it's difficult to kind of digest the rapidity with which demand is rising. So there needs to be a public policy response to manage that. And we can certainly, I think we should have a voice in shaping that public policy response so that the quote unquote negative impacts of AI can be, mitigated and digested and managed effectively. Also, AI is a fantastically effective enabler. And I've seen evidence of it getting used to good effect to not just achieve energy efficiencies, which is the very obvious place where you have benefits, not to mention all the other benefits that are outside the climate space, but also to help trigger a rethinking of how we prioritize strategic choices. And that sounds very abstract, but it's really that it is now a dimension that we in the board need to understand and integrate much more proactively so that we make better strategic choices, not just, tactical and execution and efficiency choices, which is where it's easiest for us to understand its positive impacts.
Yeah. It seems there's an educational component on climate as well as on AI.
Very much so.
And very much the investors could work with boards to make sure that is enhanced.
Very much so. And there are investors that have been looking into this issue and trying to, challenge boards to certainly be more transparent about what they're already doing. And I'm aware of an AI governance project that is specifically aimed at board directors. It's led by KPMG. But that actively includes investors in the working group so as to incorporate the investor perspective into the expectations that are set for directors around AI governance.
Great. Now, Karina, as you know, at this show, we also ask people to bring us a piece of art that is close to them, that has a sustainability or a climate or societal element to it. And I know you have thought of one.
Yep, I have. So you have the photo, so I'm hoping you can put it up. It's of a piece of art that I bought in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, shortly after the catastrophic earthquake. My then 23-year-old daughter went there to work as an urban planner, and she lived there for 3 years. And I went there to celebrate her 25th birthday. And she took me to the port at Port-au-Prince, which is every sustainability professional's nightmare. All right. It was like being pitched back into the, early 19th century, looking at, both port workers, like dock workers, but also informal workers who were sort of, milling around and doing businesses of all imaginable descriptions. And this one activity, which has now gained real celebrity in the art world, is artists, and they are brilliantly talented artisans who recover discarded oil drums, cut off the lid and the bottom. The lid, of course, has a hole that is closable. And they, first of all, use blowtorches to burn off the enamel coating. So you can imagine the fumes that these people are inhaling without masks. They don't have gloves. They don't have goggles. They don't have any protective clothing. They're handling a flame, and it's shocking. And I was a party to this because I bought artwork there. But it's their livelihood, and they bash these pieces of metal. So the curved ones, the cylindrical ones, they bash into flat panels, and they then poke them and cut them and shape them, and they make the most extraordinary shapes. And then the lids, which are thicker and more rigid, they also cut out. They typically make them into these masks where the spout is the mouth, and then they cut out eyes, and they have all these expressions that clearly are descended from the 16th century African artistic traditions that they carried over and have been perpetuated over the centuries. It's stunning. So this particular piece is of a, oh God, what are those bicycles with two seats? They have a name. Tandem. It's called a tandem. And so it has a man and a woman riding this bicycle, and I have it hanging on my wall, slightly at an angle so it looks like they're climbing up a hill. And I just love this piece. So
thank you. Thank you. That's great. And it's so much in there, like oil and gas and recycling and health and safety, and it's fantastic. So thank you, Karina. Look, last thing before we close is a quick set of fire questions. Really, just a few seconds response. So, best country climate governance regulation.
I'm going to get shot for this, but I think that the CSRD coming out of the EU, and I also think the EU deforestation regulation. So I've cited two, even though that one has been put on hold.
Most important responsible investment strategy, integration or engagement?
Yes.
Best board committee to be on?
Risk. And simply because it's the one that has the most clout. I thought being sustainability was the most interesting, but risk has the most clout.
Main AI risk, governance or environmental?
Governance.
Scenarios, 1.5 or more?
Okay, this one gets me really upset. All right, I'm going to be a little longer. There's a lot of talk about how 1.5 is dead, and it reminds me of that saying that you prepare for war, but you strive for peace. Okay, so it would be unrealistic to pretend that war is not a risk, and to work, to run a national budget as if there's no risk of military attack. At the same time, if you drop the hope for peace, you are going to be a warmonger, and you will be in a perpetual state of conflict. It's similar with this in the sense that we have to prepare for a world that fails to meet the 1.5 degree target. We have to, at a governmental level, at a corporate level, at a societal level, we have to prepare for a world that gets up to beyond 2 degrees. It would be grossly irresponsible not to. But that does not mean that we give up making every conceivable effort to stay within that very narrow corridor that will lead us to 1.5 degrees. So this is how I reconcile these two concepts of realism and aspiration. You cannot have one without the other.
Great. So last question, climate governance in 2026 in one word.
Tenacity.
Super. Karina, that's amazing. Thank you so much. In thinking of this, there's a lot of learnings. My sense is maybe the don't let up and tenacity piece seem to kind of be connected, and it seems to be very much a message that comes across speaking to you. I've just joined the board, and I always think that it's a combination of challenge and support. And I read somewhere that challenge without support is obstruction, and
Yep.
support without challenge is complacency. So I think being able to bring those two together is really important, and is what I've heard you say, and I think it's also what I've seen you do in your own life experience. So again, thank you, Karina, for being on the show.
My great pleasure. Thank you for the brilliant questions.
No problem. Hope to see you soon. And thanks also, Jen Sisson, ICGN, to actually connecting us again. And thanks for Curtis Fowl for production of the show. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and comment. We hope to see you in the next show. And until then, stay wired.